Welcome everyone. This is C26 Plus. This is the workshop from the US-Mexico Foundation and AWS. We're gonna start this session today, and we have three panels that we're gonna join in this 3-hour session. I'm here with Jana Nelson from AWS. We are your hosts. And we're gonna go right away for the first panel. We're gonna talk about competitiveness in digital economy. Then we're gonna talk about entrepreneurship, and we're gonna talk also about smart borders.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jana Nelson. I'm the lead for Latin America at the AWS Institute, the think tank for technology and public policy for our Amazon Web Services. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you to the speakers and moderators, the commentators, to those who are listening to us today. Thank you for your time and for your dedication to competitiveness in the North American economy. There's a lot of noise in the bilateral relationship, but when you get down to brass tacks, what really matters is growing the North American economy, growing the Mexican and US economy, and ensuring that we have transparent and responsive governments for their citizens. And one way to do that is through technology. Today, we're going to talk about different ways in which we can do that. One way is through startups. One way is through governments becoming more digital. One way is through trade. And those are our three panels that Enrique also outlined. So this is what our conversation is about. It's about how to help the US and Mexico adapt to a digital economy, and how to help these governments spend less, do more, and help their economies grow. Thank you.
Let's go to our first panel, and Paul Triolo is going to be the first moderator for competitiveness in digital economy.
Okay, well, thank you, Enrique and Jana, for the great introduction. I think we have a lot to talk about today. The timing is great. We have, we're coming up on the anniversary ratification of the USMCA. We're coming out of the pandemic, and I think it's a great time to be talking about these digital economy issues in the US-Mexico relationship. I think it's also a really important time when globally there are a lot of issues around data governance that we can touch on. We're also in this transition into a whole new mobile generation between 4G and 5G, which is going to lead to an explosion in data. And see massive amounts of data flying around generated by the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, fintech, and other emerging technologies and applications that will drive the digital economy. So today, before us, we have a great series of questions for our panelists that we're going to touch on a lot of these issues around how regulatory issues will affect the digital economy in North America, particularly in US-Mexico context. And I think, as we know, the trade agreements like the USMCA and also the comprehensive TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, these have set sort of the global gold standard around issues like digital economy. And so I think we're at a really critical moment now where these trade agreements are being implemented and impacting digital governance around these issues like particularly data. So I think we'll start off with some of the challenges here. I think we've divided the panels into different sections. We're going to start off with some of the challenges, particularly for Mexico. Our first panelist is Valeria Moy, an economist and general director of IMCO, the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness. Valeria, I'd like to get a sense to kick us off here about what do you think are some of the issues that are sort of holding Mexico back in the digital economy arena? And how should we think about some of the major challenges facing Mexico going forward in the digital domain here? And then we'll move on to the other panels. But I want to get a sort of set the stage here as we try to tackle the issues around the digital economy and USMCA.
Sure, Paul, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with you. I think it's a very complicated array of issues. I don't think it's only one issue. I wouldn't say it's only a political issue or a regulatory issue. I think we have a complete different set of issues that is impeding Mexico of taking more advantage of this digital or this new economy, as you might say. For example, there is very unequal access to technology in the country. Last week, I was reviewing the data for a specific state called Zacatecas. Zacatecas is in the northern part of the country. is very linked to the US, very linked to the productive change. So Zacatecas is one of the states that you would think that is very well integrated, not only with the country itself, but with the northern countries, with the United States and with Canada. And while I was reviewing the data pertinent to Zacatecas, I found out that only 41% of the houses have internet access. That's very, very low. I mean, you would have expected for Zacatecas, being in a developed part of the country, to have much more internet access to its population. So we have very unequal technology infrastructure in the different parts of the country. We have some security issues as well. There is a generational gap. For example, my generation or my parents' generation are very untrustful. We don't trust in some cases technology, or we don't trust the use of our data. So we are very reluctant to use technology in some arenas or in some way. I mean, of course, you can buy some stuff, but it's very difficult to include the general population in these dynamics. I think this generational issue will start to fade away, of course, with time. My kids, for example, and millennials have a completely different concept on this. And then again, we have very unequal access to, we have very different regions regarding financial inclusion. So you might say that, I mean, in order to make digital transactions or digital anything, you would have to have financial inclusion. And we have a severe problem in that in Mexico, in the whole country. That's very pertinent to all of the country, and much more in the southern part of the country, but it's a regular issue. And then, of course, we have some regulatory issues, and Amazon Web Services is very aware of this. For example, you need to have a physical site to have the server. So that's a huge constraint for small financial firms that want to provide fintech services. So we have a whole array of different problems that we might need to address one by one.
Those are great. Those are great questions. I think one of the big issues that you raised toward the end there, I'd like to just pull a string on that a little bit more, is the regulatory issue. I mean, regulatory lag around digital issues is not uncommon globally. You see this in a lot of countries and blocks. What do you see as the particular challenges facing Mexico in sort of getting ahead on the regulatory issues, and particularly in the U.S. context and in the context of the trade agreement?
I think that we have to be much more in touch with what is going on in the world, not only what's going on in Mexico. I have been seeing this past 2 years a country, Mexico, that is only looking to itself, only looking inwards, instead of looking what the world is doing, or instead of learning what the world is doing. And I think that's a major constraint right now. It's very usual, it's very common to see that technology and financial instruments always move before regulation does, but it moves faster when you don't even take a look of what's going on in the rest of the world. So I think that we need to speed them up. We need to try to push the regulatory agencies to say, hello, this is what the world is moving towards, and we need to do something about it. Otherwise, our country and our people and our population would be really left behind in this technological wave, that it's actually an opportunity to include much more people, millions of people, if I could say, to this financial arena, instead of people moving and doing their daily transactions with cash, which is the case in Mexico, specifically with the informal sector that conducts a huge part of the Mexican economy.
Great. Okay, so yeah, I think you've done a good job of setting the stage here. We've got, uneven regional differences in terms of things like access to the internet, financial inclusion. These are some of the themes we'll try to touch on. And then, of course, the whole issue of a regulatory approach to these to sort of move the ball forward. Of course, this is all about challenges and opportunities here. So let's bring in Sarah Heck, who is the head of entrepreneurship and Latin America public policy at Stripe, to sort of delve a little bit deeper into some of the challenges in this fintech arena, financial inclusion. Sarah is working to enable entrepreneurs around the world to start and grow internet businesses. So I think that's one of the key areas of the discussion today is sort of, improving those issues that Valeria raised around sort of access and to both sort of the underlying technology, but the key critical things like financial services and fintech. So Sarah, what do you see as some of the challenges, particularly for companies in the U.S. and Canada, operating and looking at the new digital landscape in Mexico, sort of post USMCA? Are there problems that are unique to this sector, do you see, in particular, such as fintech, or are some of the other issues that we may want to bring in here going to also impact how the sort of regulatory approach develops around fintech and how to tackle some of those questions like financial inclusion?
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me. I think this is a really important discussion, and I think obviously when you're onto the USMCA, a new government in the US, and shifting dynamics in Mexico in the post-pandemic, I don't know if we're ever going to be post-pandemic economy, certainly has us thinking about how to work more closely with Mexican businesses, both the small and medium enterprise, the PYMEs, all the way up to enterprise, large companies, US and otherwise, that are really looking to invest in Mexico, and making sure that we as Stripe are able to provide a payments platform and broader digital financial services, and frankly, economic infrastructure that is digital and will allow Mexico to leapfrog into the 21st century. I sort of look at the post-pandemic economy, particularly for Latin America, and I think it's a region that obviously is really close to the hearts of everybody on this call. But we are always waiting for Latin American economies to realize themselves, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think the pandemic actually provides an opportunity for Mexico and other economies to leapfrog into arenas that Southeast Asian economies are already at. But the digitalization can really be a leveling of the playing field moment. And I think there are certainly challenges, but I think it's important to point out, particularly for Mexico, fintech is blossoming in Mexico. It's not just outside or non-local players like Stripe. It's many firms within Mexico, huge amounts of billions of dollars worth of investment. There was a 50% increase in people that were accessing digital financial services through their cell phone this year. And so, yes, there is a wide gap of where we're going, but I think that the pandemic has actually accelerated the opportunity to do this and have financial inclusion and economic inclusion, both for individuals and families, but also businesses that we want to bring into the formal economy, not just because it's the right thing to do and the transparent thing to do, but also because if they are in the formal economy, they have the ability to sell cross-border, not only to the US under USMCA, but also across the region. And so I think I want to first lay the framework that I'm actually quite optimistic, as long as we all work together across government and private sector and academics to think critically about it. I also look at things like the Mexican fintech law, and I think that was done with, I think, really good intention. I think that in a space, particularly in fintech, where literally every country in the world, almost, including the US and Europe, is thinking about new frameworks about how we regulate this sort of activity. I was really encouraged that Mexico was sort of like out in front on that. I think where the issue arises is sort of where the rubber meets the road, and how do we make sure that in implementation of regulation, that governments are actually speaking with a myriad of players, particularly small players that are really trying to enter and accelerate the market, but also enter and accelerate financial inclusion and economic access. And so, I guess this is from our side, it's a call to action to make sure that those conversations are taking place. I think we do have concerns around a handful of ways that things are being implemented with, I guess, under the USMCA. I think one of them is sort of speaking to our friends and colleagues at AWS, who I know this issue quite well, requirements for data cloud redundancy, specifically for fintechs and not for other financial service institutions. That, we don't see this as data localization, but you can see how that could move quickly, and it's a very sort of unequal playing field. I think particularly for us, we are looking at the way that this is sort of nerdy and payments wonky, but the way that the actual card networks are set up in the US, or sorry, in Mexico, is not allowing for Visa and MasterCard to be a part of it. And not only are they not allowed to be a part of it, it actually creates a lot of friction and complexity within the markets, specifically for small businesses that are trying to enter the formal economy. So, and how does this manifest itself? It means that authorization rates for transactions have some of the lowest rates that we see around the world. What is going to be the incentive for a small business to enter the online economy if 40% of their transactions are being rejected every time somebody wants to buy that really great, leather purse that they think is so wonderful from Oaxaca, or whatever it is that these small businesses are building online. And frankly, there is a customer market around the world for it. I mean, this is what the opportunity is for Mexico. But a lot of the ways that the systems are set up, I think could use a bit of a refresh. And like I said, I think this is something that it's not just Mexico that's going through it, the US is going through it too. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us in the coming year, especially in this moment where everybody is focused on sort of the opportunity with fintech and the opportunity for economic digital access. How can we build the foundations correctly now versus waiting until it's too late, and these sort of rails and antiquated regulatory schemes that don't speak to the necessities of an internet economy are here forever. So I'll stop there, but happy
that's
to
great.
chat more about.
That's great. We'll come back to this. I think you've laid out some great sort of framework for some of these challenges going forward. I'd like to also hear from Rodney MacDonald, who is head of international corporate affairs at Intuit and QuickBooks, in terms of sort of to pull a little bit more on the issue of how some of these regulatory issues, such as as cloud data redundancy, are impacting that sector. And then I'd love to hear from Rodney also if he has a sense of, are there any lessons to be learned from other similar economies or trade agreements that could apply to Mexico in this context, and how to think about the problem going forward.
Sure. Thanks very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to everyone on the panel for this very interesting conversation. When I think about the new USMCA, what is not changed is that, North America will continue to be the most productive trading bloc in the world and hopefully become even more efficient. And we know that in Mexico, the efficiency of small businesses, as others have pointed out, is held back by the lack of digital adoption. Only 7% of pymes in Mexico are adopting or using technology. And so, for our technology, we're a financial management platform used by 7 million people, 7 million small businesses globally. We just launched in Mexico about a year and a half ago. And we're learning a lot of lessons because our core markets are really the English-speaking countries, UK, Australia, Canada, US. And now we're launching into more regulatorily complex places. And Mexico actually ranks first in the world for accounting complexity. And that is working at direct counter purpose to the goal of the Mexican government. Any developing economy, their number one goal is to broaden the tax base. And so what do they have to do to bring more small businesses into compliance with their tax authority? They need to make it more attractive. They need to make it easier to comply. And that's obviously not something that I can do for the Mexican government or that Intuit can do for them. We can, however, bring down the compliance time for those small businesses who adopt digital technologies. And so, for example, a typical small or small business in Mexico is using about 5 different accounting and financial management platforms. That could be their payment platform, their accounting, their accountant, their bookkeeper. And that adds up to a very scary number of about 20 hours on average per month being spent on just financial and tax compliance. We've seen that when small and micro businesses adopt a digital tool like QuickBooks or any of our competitors, I'm not in sales, I promise, it goes from 16 to 20 hours of compliance time per month down to 2. Okay, so you just extrapolate that across the Mexican economy. The opportunity there is huge, but as Valeria pointed out, there's unequal access to the very essential needs of technology, which would be internet and broadband access. And just finally, one stat that I personally want to see hatcheted away at in this role is there's a 75% failure rate of micro and small businesses within the first 2 years of startup in Mexico. That compares with about 48% failure rate in the United States and about 52% in Canada. So there's a real lacuna between the failure rate of small businesses in Mexico and small businesses in Canada and the US. So, the challenge is big, but we're proving it that digital adoption does move the marker. Thanks.
Great. Now that's a really interesting perspective about the impact of the lack of access to digital digital tools and sort of infrastructure on the business environment. Also, directly, you related this directly to the Mexican government in terms of things like expanding the tax base. So obviously, a lot of really interesting pieces to this puzzle. I'd like to now bring in Kenneth Smith, who is a partner at Agon and focuses on helping international clients to identify trade and foreign direct investment opportunities derived from the new generation of free trade agreements like USMCA, of course, and CPTPP. Ken has some really great background in this arena, and I think we've sort of been looking at the challenges and then some of the opportunities here with all the speakers. I'd like to have Ken step back a little bit and talk a little bit about sort of how to think about the way forward here. We've identified a lot of problems. How can Mexico take best advantage of some of the provisions that were that negotiators worked very hard to put into something as complex as USMCA? So in Mexico, needs, everybody agrees that Mexico should lever the benefits to help push the digital economy forward. But what are are there any low-hanging fruit here, or is this sort of the start of a process that's going to take some time? What should the Mexican government and the business community be thinking of in terms of what things to avoid, perhaps, in terms of going forward and implementing some of the key provisions of something as complex as USMCA? Ken?
Well, thank you very much, Paul. First of all, thank you to the US-Mexico Foundation and AWS for the invitation to be here today. And as we have seen from the discussion in this panel and from the evolution of the world economy over the last few years, especially what we have seen during the pandemic, the digital economy is definitely the way of the future. Whether we're talking about business-to-business connection or directly business to consumers, whether you're talking about digital trade in goods or digital services that span anywhere from education, cloud computing systems, video streaming, telemedicine, obviously fintech. We've concentrated a little bit here on the financial services. I mean, the sky's the limit as to where this can go. And I agree completely with Valeria when she says that there's a lot of uneven ground in Mexico. The big cliche is that Mexico is made up of several Mexicos, and we see that with the digital divide. The key aspect of success in this is, of course, connectivity, the access to internet, the ability to grow digital sales, the ability to have a regulatory framework that supports and facilitates these types of activities. The good news here is that if you see the progress in Latin America and in Mexico in particular, for example, concentrating on digital trade, Latin America saw its sales on digital sales increase 21% in 2019. And in Mexico, they grew 35%, which I believe is the highest rate of growth in the world. So we are seeing a lot more penetration, a lot more use. It's still limited to a certain portion of the population and more concentrated on certain regions, large urban centers, the areas that are more industrialized and the higher levels of education. But at the end of the day, one of the key recommendations is that you need the appropriate legal and regulatory framework for the digital economy to thrive. And this can be seen from two perspectives: what you do domestically, which I will tackle in a second, and how do you prop those regulations and the legal framework domestically through international commitments. And that's where the USMCA comes in and that we can take advantage of. Because there are plenty of chapters, whether you're talking about a digital trade chapter that, of course, sets up the rules in terms of facilitating digital trade, establishing no localization requirements, cooperation on cybersecurity, financial services. We've been talking about the efforts also to prohibit data localization requirements with certain restrictions so that regulators can have access to the information. There's a chapter on SMEs, on trade facilitation. We don't think about this, but on customs administration and trade facilitation, the advantage of using information technologies to accelerate the times goods through the border is essential. So we can use a lot of digitalization technologies to do this. So let's just say that the USMCA is peppered with specific provisions that look to facilitate the growth of the digital economy. One of the main goals in the negotiation, of course, was to modernize the agreement and to include those disciplines that are essential to today's world economy. 25 years ago, everything we're talking about today would have sounded like science fiction. So what we do in the USMCA, we added 12 chapters that deal with many issues, but primarily when we're talking about digital trade and the growth of the digital economy is how to facilitate the creation of a framework that can spur the growth of both digital trade and digital services. So in terms of specific recommendations, I mean, I do believe that promoting innovation and adoption of technology is key. This goes hand in hand with, of course, having access to internet, complying with the USMCA and the regulations that are established there, the rules, let's say, that have to be reflected in domestic regulations. There are several issues there in terms of some policies that the Mexican government has taken recently, but complying with the USMCA is key. Obviously, promoting innovation and adoption of technology through more access to internet for the population. But in terms of public policy, I also think that we have in Mexico to rethink this idea of complete austerity across the board and really concentrate on increasing the budget, for example, on key areas for digitizing the government, which will increase efficiency and actually lead to savings, not like the austerity programs that we're seeing right now. And also for key areas such as CONACYT, our Center for Science and Technology, and increase research and development. And we have to get away from these old paradigms. You know, we've heard people in CONACYT, especially the director, talk about moving away from neoliberal technologies and things that really sound like a 1960s, Cuban manifesto. And we do not need that in Mexico right now. Our success over the last 25 years has been precisely, as was mentioned before, I believe from Valeria, on learning from the experiences in other countries. So strengthening the budget for research and development, also in the area of education, there's a huge area there of opportunity. We are still dead last in the OECD when it comes to percentage of students who have access to internet in schools. And that is unacceptable for a country that's so integrated trade-wise with US, Canada, and the rest of the world. And we need support there for technical and engineering schools. You know, if we are going to be able to tap into the app economy, so to speak, the ability to develop engineers who have innovation and creativity in them to develop all of these areas that we're talking about, we need to start with proper education. And SMEs, I think, is at the center, is sort of the anchor of all of these ideas, because SMEs are closely linked, not just through the what I would call democratization of international trade by virtue of a micro enterprise through a computer and a server being able to access millions of consumers in the US and Canada through the USMCA. That's a great, very important aspect of it, but also the linkages to supply chains in North America. I always envy when the US points out in their talking points that in the United States, most of trade is done by SMEs. And in Mexico, it's the contrary. And that's something that we have not been able to do despite the success of the NAFTA. Hopefully we'll be able to do it better under USMCA, to link up SMEs, to the traditional sectors, and also to advanced manufacturing, but also to the digital economy. And for all of that, you need the appropriate regulatory framework. I will leave it at that. And of course, we can continue the discussion to pinpoint specific areas where the Mexican government and society and the private sector can concentrate its efforts.
Thanks, Ken. That was great. That was really a great. You raised a great set of issues and sort of a nice framework for thinking about the sort of bigger problem. I think you did raise a key issue here, which I want our next panelist to tackle, which is education. We have Dany Bahar, who's a senior fellow in global economic and development at Brookings, whose research has sat at the intersection of international economics and economic development. And I'm curious, because it seems like this is a really fundamental issue in a lot of areas, sort of education, both sort of more generally in terms of STEM education, and also sort of at the government and regulatory level, where oftentimes there's a need for sort of raising the level of understanding around these more complicated issues in the digital economy. So Dany, I wonder if you could just give us a sense of and build on sort of some of the comments that Ken talked about, the importance of education, and how has Mexico tackled improving things like graduate education in areas such as STEM, because I think this is sort of a part of the longer term solution to some of these issues, which is critical, the education piece.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks. It's really always a pleasure to participate in the activities of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation. That I think they're doing an incredible job in putting these topics in the front line, and I'm pleased to be part of this phenomenal panel. So, I mean, I think I want to build on going through your question and a little bit what Ken said, and perhaps also on might take a little bit on what Valeria said at the beginning. And I think that, when you think of a broader context, the way I see this challenge or the future of digital trade in the context of USMCA, I think it's not only a question whether the USMCA in itself provides a good platform for Mexico, but in practice, whether Mexico is ready to take up the challenges, even if there is a good framework for that. And there, I'm not sure that it has only to do with regulation, but with deeper issues, and some of that, as you said in your question, you hinted on that. And I think that the answer is twofold. I mean, I do think that definitely there's part of Mexico, the bigger firms, that are ready for the challenge, and I have no doubt that they will, play a huge role in deepening this digital trade. But I think for the most part of Mexico, unless there are structural reforms that could really, prepare the field, we're probably not going to see a lot of that. And that's a lot of what my colleagues were talking about. And this is super relevant, I think, because if we think about how are we going to measure success of the USMCA in 5 or 10 years, it will have to do, and whether Mexico itself will want to keep engaging into more integration and more globalization, it will have to do with whether it's moving the needle not only for the 20% of the economy, but also for the 80% of the labor force that, it's in the informal sector, and, it's also concentrated a lot in the southern part of Mexico and in the poorest part of the country. And I think this is a big challenge for USMCA in the future, not only in the context of digital trade, but in a more broader context, the same way that NAFTA couldn't perhaps overcome this challenge as much as we had expected. Then the question to me as an economist is like, well, are we, do we have the proper, is this treaty going to be enough to see call centers in Chiapas? Is this treaty going to be enough to see firms managing Google Ads in Puebla or in Guerrero? Or are we going to see fintech firms in Oaxaca? A question, an academic question perhaps, is like, what is keeping the poorest parts of Mexico to experience this structural transformation process that will take the economy from agriculture, manufacturing, to services and to digital trade, as it has happened in Asian economies as they grow? And the answer to me is, it's not only about USMCA, it's much broader. And there, going back to your original question, there's the need for important infrastructure investment where we're talking about connectivity, and yes, not less importantly, skills. On top of the basic things such as or not so basic, such as financial inclusion that Valeria was alluding to, which I think, of course, play a big role. And here we have an inherent chicken and egg problem. Firms won't invest in these parts of Mexico until the capabilities are there, but the capabilities won't emerge until there's some investment. It's a very tough problem to tackle, where government could do some. Not sure if this government, but government could do some of this process. That perhaps needs to go beyond the idea. I mean, not to leave it only for USMCA to work, because based on what we know from NAFTA, it needs more than that. And you know, maybe the answer is on deeper integration when we think about a bigger, you know, moving the region to a much deeper integration process, where we think about migration, which part of the research that I do has a lot to do with moving. Sometimes you don't have to create the skills, sometimes you have to move them around. And that's a possibility, but we're very far away from that. But we know from research that these, you know, migration patterns could really push the emergence of new sectors in the economy. But of course, at the same time, it's a big risk. You cannot put all those eggs in the same basket. So I think public-private partnerships are crucial here. And I think that the discussion is like, what is it going to take from the firms, perhaps some of our colleagues in the panel, what is it going to take for them to invest in a place like Puebla, or a place like Chiapas, or a place like Guerrero? And I do think public-private partnerships play a role here. And that's why I'm so excited about this initiative in particular, because I think what could emerge from it can really bring great things in this direction.
Great, Dany. I really appreciate those comments. Before we jump into the Q&A, I'd like to just offer an opportunity for an expert commentator, Bernardo Bazua, to just make a brief comment on some of the issues that we've raised so far in the panel. He is a director at Omnichannel and Digital from Capel, and we'll make some brief comments before we jump fully into the Q&A.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to join this interesting panel. Definitely the US-Mexico relationship around digital commerce has really represented a lot of challenges. Technology-wise, you spend a lot of time speaking about it. We definitely need to help the small and medium-sized businesses of both countries to truly have easier, faster, and accessible access to technology. Not only the technology to manage their business, but the technology to truly do cross-border trade. And honestly, I believe that from a business standpoint, the marketplaces that are in place in both countries we have a huge responsibility in terms of enabling these small and medium-sized businesses to truly start making cross-border trade among our countries. Education, financial inclusion, it's a key topic. It's really tough to speak about digital economies without thinking on how to truly digitalize the financial services for the population in Mexico, making sure that we have a decent and really useful internet access is a key topic, not only for the population, but also for the businesses. This post-COVID, the internet usage is on the sky. The services that the Mexican population is receiving throughout the country is really, really poor, and it's really non-acceptable. So it's really hard for the population, for the small businesses to start an online business and start truly being competitive without having a decent internet access. So definitely there's a big room to work there. Education-wise, there's a lot of financial education, not only for the consumer, but also for the small and medium-sized business. Both marketplaces, the financial institutions, and the government should spend time and effort to truly educate how the cross-border should be done. What are the new regulations? What are the benefits of the USMCA new agreement? What are the benefits of doing international cross-border trade? And I think that there's a huge gap of information on how can really these businesses start doing things online. And the last thing is to truly have a digital inclusion. How can we really digitalize the economies, the local cities, the small towns throughout Mexico? Because it's the only way to truly build a business from scratch or to take the business to the next level. If we don't go and reach out to the small communities, it's going to be really hard for them to truly be competitive under the new space. You'll be fighting with the huge marketplaces in the world, with the huge CPG companies, and there won't be room to grow for the small and medium-sized businesses. So competitiveness is something we really need to look deeper, and we have to make a partnership between the companies, the government, and the financial institutions to truly take this to the next level.
Excellent. Thanks, Bernardo, for those comments. I think these structural issues are clearly, something that are going to need to be tackled here, in addition to the regulatory ones. I'd also like to just give a quick nod to David Jimenez, who's a managing director at Softtech, to just make a few remarks too before we head into the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was not expecting this, but hi, Paul, and hi, everyone on the panel. Sorry, can you hear me well?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear did you ask me something, or was just my take on the conversation?
Yeah, I'd like to just get your take on some of the issues raised around structural issues around access, and if you have anything to say on this on the regulatory front also. Sure. I more than on the regulatory front, because from hearing your panel, I think they're more fluent than I am on regulatory issues. But probably what I can tell you is, of course, or we could have better regulations, or we could have better ways to promote different states in the country, as Valeria was saying. But I would probably emphasize a little bit about what Sarah was talking about. I think there's also the other side that we can really elaborate on, and how many good things we are seeing, right? The financial inclusion, yeah, it's not necessarily where we want it, but you can see the fintech law and a lot of the different companies thriving. We see a lot of venture capital right now in Mexico, and we see a lot of different startups starting to blossom. I work for Softtech, and we are a professional IT services based out of Mexico, specifically Monterrey, Mexico, but we have operations globally. And there's things to highlight, like what's been happening in Aguascalientes for the last 15 years. The government in Aguascalientes 15, 18 years ago really understood the potential of IT services in the country. We were some of the first to start operations there, and now you have probably 6 of the 10 biggest firms in the world with operations there, and also you have CPG companies and other companies, just to not do marketing here, but having operations there and delivering services from their global. Those services, important to highlight, are services that are probably paid 4x, 3.5 to 4.5x the average salary in the state. So I mean, just to emphasize a little bit, yes, we have lack of some regulatory issues. Yes, the policy right now from the government is not the one that we would like, but there's also tons of talent in the IT digital spectrum to show tons of potential. Excellent. No, that's a good segue into our Q&A. We're getting a few questions from the audience here. I'll try to bring back this all around to all the panelists. One of the questions I think which relates to what David was saying was for Rodney, and the question was, can you speak more about the difference of startup failure rates across the 3 countries you mentioned? I think you mentioned the US, Canada, and Mexico, and what specifically you think are the leading contributors to such a high failure rate in Mexico, and how does sort of the digital infrastructure or other issues we've discussed today help play into that, improving that kind of dynamic in Mexico?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So you know, the country in the world that is the best place to start a small business is the United States. You know, nowhere in Europe that's a major country can compare to that. And there's a number of factors why. I mean, access to rural broadband is much better across the United States than it is in Canada or Mexico. But I think the biggest reason is financial services. You know, we know that small businesses get this sort of meteoric rise and they get this initial boost, and then they need money to scale and to really get to the next level. And you know, the United States is really the head of the pack when it comes to these three countries with access to capital for small businesses. And I think Canada would be the closest second, where, you know, so that's one aspect. We just did a fairly exhaustive research paper with the Instituto Mexicano de Competitividad, which was my best effort at pronouncing that. Well and looking at these reasons for barriers to small business growth. And they're very, very different than in Canada and the US. And this is something our company is learning for the first time. You know, we've been in very Commonwealth legal systems for 35 years. And now we're learning that Mexico is very different. You know, the challenges faced by small businesses throughout the pandemic interlay the cartel violence and, you know, extortion being a pressure that small businesses in Canada and the US don't even have a concept of. So look, everyone on this panel kind of looks at this from a different angle, and we all have a different way that we can help. But I think the survival rate is a good indicator. And, you know, I think I mentioned in my initial remarks that there's only 7% of Mexican SMEs are using technology.
That's really
right? And then you've got 75% failure rate within the first 2 years. That's a 25% delta, more or less, between Canada and the US versus Mexico. So I think from the perspective of Intuit, it's really that digital adoption barrier we need to get over.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's an issue that maybe we can bore down a little bit more on. With Sarah, I'd like to get your view. There was a question about you know, the role here of the U.S. and Exim Bank and IFC, based on your experience in the U.S. you know, in the U.S. government. How do you see potentially the U.S. playing a greater role here in terms of helping with these the you know, sort of drive the financial piece of this? This seems like a pretty important part of the equation in terms of you know, both getting SMEs online and then facilitating access to capital.
Yeah, so thanks for looping me in, and Rodney, I couldn't agree with you more about sort of the best place for financial services for small businesses in the US, but let's be very clear, there's a long way to go in the US. And I think, you know, fintech and other digital services are making that easier. And there should be no reason why that can't be easily scaled to a place like Mexico, especially when you have these digital tools that, if it weren't for regulatory barriers, you could probably transport fairly directly with obviously some localization. So I just a +1 for that, and don't despair, Mexico. It is possible. You know, on what the U.S. government should be doing. I wrote it in the chat, but I think that I'll expand on it. There are aspects of our SBA programs that I think could be greatly improved, but I do think that there is something to be said for a single point where small businesses can go to both get information about how to build a business, how to utilize certain tools, but also to get access to capital that is specifically for small businesses. I'd love to see that access to capital flow more easily through digital means. And as you know, we review, you know, I think a great example is the PPP loans in the US. the ability to make sure that that money could get to a small business in a matter of hours instead of a matter of days was really important to making sure that they could survive. And we should be doing the same thing for just regular run-of-the-mill. Can we use data to make sure that we understand that a small business actually might only need $5,000 to scale rather than a $25,000 loan that they won't be able to pay back as quickly or have higher interest rates on? And so let's be really bespoke about what businesses need, depending on where they are geographically, what industry they're in, what their consumer base looks like, what they want to do in terms of scaling. And I think that this is something that, SBA can work on. USAID certainly can. When I was in government, we started a program called Young Latin American Leaders that was essentially for entrepreneurs across the region to make sure that they were connecting with our US counterparts, because we know that small business owners and entrepreneurs, it can be very lonely if you don't know what you're doing and you need help navigating, and you can't necessarily go to school to learn that sort of stuff. So I think that there's a lot more that can and should be done. I think I'm also, frankly, really encouraged by, it's not enough yet, but increased number of investors, particularly out of Silicon Valley and out of the US, that are investing in Latin America, because I think that they actually help build networks of small business owners and entrepreneurs that can be connecting cross-border and learning best practices. So I think the US government should be facilitating that to the extent possible, both with their own programs, but also building public-private partnerships.
Fantastic, fantastic. And we're sort of getting a little short on time, so that's a great perspective. I want to bring in Valeria again, and then maybe finish with Ken on some of go back to the regulatory issues. But Valeria, we have a really interesting question in the Q&A that around the chicken and egg dilemma of skills development. Do you have a sense of what 2 or 3 concrete things that both governments could do to facilitate and improve cross-border skill development in the digital economy could be? And I'd love to have maybe Dany jump in on that too.
Well, I think there are many things to do. It's not only infrastructure, it's not only developing skills. I think the government has to do some specific nudges in order for people to adopt these technologies. And for example, the crisis that we are living, I would have loved to use the past that we lived last year, would have opened the door to change some issues regarding the use of cash, for example, in Mexico. But I think it's not too late. We can always do something about it. And the only way, and it's really the only way to include SMEs in the benefits of trade and of these USMCAs is to use the digital economy. There won't be any other option. There won't be any other solution. And there we need to link what people learn at school or in colleges or in technical studies to what the firms need, to what the reality demands. So for example, in Mexico, we are not teaching kids to code, or we're not teaching kids to speak English, or we're lacking behind a lot of specific skills that people might need to become friendlier to implement this digital technology. So I think there are many things that we can do. And in that regard, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we could use. With very small interventions, you can arrive to huge results, because we're so behind in some specific areas or in some specific regions of the country that with very small nudges, the results could be impressive.
Excellent. No, that's a great response. Dan, do you have anything to add there? And then I'll jump
30 seconds. 30
Okay.
seconds. I think I'm a big believer of migration, and I think that actually the US-Mexico Foundation put forward a great report on alley shoring, talking about how there could be like more integration in terms of moving skills from the US to Mexico and vice versa. And I think that's a great starting point in that conversation.
Excellent, excellent, great. Well, I'd like to sort of give Ken the last word here. I mean, there's a question from the audience, and maybe we can just hit quickly on this specifically about which policies, Mexican policies that you mentioned that are making improvements really challenging. Is there something in the short term that we should be looking for, or that we can focus on as a sign, sort of that things are improving on the regulatory front? Because I think that's a critical area in addition to all the other many challenges we've talked about for Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're facing challenges because in a time of crisis, there's this tendency that Valeria referred to as looking inward. There's a lot of push, for example, in the Congress to push for certain initiatives that look to, for example, establish taxes on digital transactions, trying to have a misplaced sense of nationalism where we should make it harder for the film industry from the US or Canada to enter into streaming services in Mexico, which is the wrong approach. What you should do is develop your own sector in terms of services and digitalize them and help them penetrate the US and Canada. I think the issues that I mentioned on budget cuts, whether it's on CONACYT, reducing the funds for research and development, as well as education. I mean, there are efforts there that I think are worrisome in terms of the direction that things could take, especially certain congressional initiatives. When you look, for example, at efforts to undo the liability waiver for internet service providers that is established in the USMCA, this is also perceived as a way of, in a way, charging internet service providers and making them responsible for content from third parties. So what we should do as a country is really to take advantage of the opportunities that the USMCA establishes. We need to comply with them if we want to have full access to the US and Canada, of course. And I do believe that there is an effort there in the Ministry of Economy to fulfill those obligations, but we are only going to be able to do it if the entire cabinet is on board. We have certain elements of regulation that is not clear in Mexico. I think Valeria and Sarah were mentioning that technology moves faster than the governments and the regulators. There is now a big debate in Mexico as to the jurisdiction for digital markets. In other words, who should be in charge of overseeing them and regulating them? Is it the Federal Telecommunications Institute, because is it a telecom issue, or is it a digital economy issue that the Federal Competition Commission should see? So there's a lot of elements there that I think are challenges, but the way to approach them is basically through consistency in regulation, compliance with the USMCA, and a point that was raised, I think, by Sarah, the public-private partnerships and can be very helpful and have been helpful in Mexico to increase connectivity. Working with large enterprises like Telmex, working with some of the big platforms on helping on government programs and getting internet and services to the people that require the most. I think those are good experiences that we should develop further in the future.
Excellent. Wow. Okay. Well, that's a good ending on sort of an upbeat note here, trying to look ahead and see, you know, we've talked about a lot of the challenges, but yeah, obviously there's lots of opportunities here. I want to thank the sponsors of this event and all the panelists for a great discussion. And hopefully we'll continue this and many other fora going forward here. But really, thanks for a really fruitful, I think, and thought-provoking discussion around these issues. So let me go ahead and turn it back over to the hosts. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to all the panelists.